Good morning, everybody. Happy Tuesday. We have an amazing show for everybody today. What do we have, Krystal?
Indeed, we do. Lots of big stories this morning. We're going to update you, of course, on what's happening on the ground in Ukraine, some new diplomatic efforts, also the fallout in the Russian economy. In addition, massive drop in the Chinese markets.
Not good.
It's really quite stunning. So we're going to talk to you about that and what is going on there. A truly brave protest unfolding on Russian state TV. We will bring you those details, as well as protests from some of the citizens in Ukraine that are now in Russian-occupied territory. So a lot of courage and bravery there. We'll break down what's going on for you with Joe Biden, some new polling there and his messaging, and some insane comments on The View, like total McCarthyite authoritarianism. I mean, it really is wild what is sort of just being casually put out there in the public space. We also have Matt Taibbi on. Excited to get his take. Of course, he lived in Russia and is a Russian speaker, actually, and it'll be great to hear from him on how he views all of the events that are unfolding. But we do want to start, as we have been, with what is unfolding on the ground in Ukraine, to the best of our knowledge.
Yeah, this is always a difficult one. And of course, we've been trying to do these battle updates every show just to give you guys an idea of what's happening on the ground. It can be difficult because what's happening on the ground has been relatively static now for the last couple of days. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. By the way, that static nature may not be a bad thing. So it shows you that there remains intense fighting there in the city of Kyiv and around there, where Russian forces are continuing to try and surround and take the capital. Over in the eastern part of the country, Russian forces fighting their way to more of the larger towns. I'm not going to try and pronounce that particular one, but it matters because they're trying to envelop a piece of the Ukrainian resistance. And then down in the southern part of the country, Russian-backed separatists had been gaining more ground in Donetsk. However, all of this could be a prelude of what we're seeing in this type and the style of warfare over the last couple of days to a possible diplomatic solution. I don't want to get anybody's hopes up, but a couple of data points were out there that made me raise my eyebrows, and I talked to some people, and they generally agree with it. So let's go ahead and put this video up there on the screen. This is a very important video because what you're watching there is the bombing of an aircraft production facility near the city of Kyiv. That's the Anatov aircraft plant. Now, why exactly did that happen? Obviously, it's to deny the enemy, but also Russia is attacking the defense industrial base of Ukraine. This is just the latest example of that happening. A lot of military analysts, Krystal, were looking at that with some puzzlement because they're like, well, in one way, if you are an imperial conquering power, you don't necessarily want to destroy part of what is going to you be able to take over.
The industrial capacity.
The industrial capacity. On the other hand, as you transition to more of a civil war type phase where it's just a war of attrition, this would of course make sense to deny the capability of the enemy. And Michael Kaufman, he's an analyst who we've been looking to and has been quite spot on really in the last couple of months. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. Here's what he says, and this is fascinating. I have come to think that the Russian military is interpreting demilitarization quite literally as a secondary war aim. They are increasingly targeting Ukraine's defense industrial capacity in strikes. So why does that matter? Here's why. Remember, a key part of the Kremlin's demands of Ukraine in any peace process is quote-unquote demilitarization. Now, what we have said is that's not going to happen if that means that Ukraine is literally not allowed to have weapons. However, and the Kremlin has actually said this in the past, let's put this up there, which is that their definition of demilitarization can change. They say demilitarization is nearly accomplished. So what do they mean by that? This was a couple of days ago. What they mean is that if they wipe out what they claim, at least to the eyes of the world, are the offensive capabilities of Ukraine that they found threatening, it would then open the door for a peace process, where at the same time, Zelensky would have to guarantee no entry into NATO and into the European Union, and then no new offensive weapons capabilities. So they are coming in, destroying the defense industrial base. They could then use that that as the pretextual definition of demilitarization, and that opens up all kinds of interesting diplomatic possibilities, which could signal a much closer end to this conflict than I think a lot of people had thought, including myself.
Yeah, I certainly hope that that's the direction that we are headed in. I did some digging. Other people seem to be familiar with Antonov, or else they were just pretending to be familiar with it, but I was
they're
not.
pretending.
Yeah, so
I think people buy
it.
their planes, actually.
Yeah, so it's actually, so it was a Soviet-era company that, of course, once the Soviet Union collapses, Ukraine takes over, it becomes a state-owned enterprise. They've built over 20,000 planes. They're sold typically in sort of, the region, the former Soviet republics, also some to the developing world. They're typically like these large cargo planes. And some of the commentary I saw online was that China and India use some of these planes, are probably going to be a little bit irritated that now, the capacity to create new parts and those sorts of things has been degraded by Russia. The other explanation here is that remember early on we saw some analysis that basically said, and I think this was some of the propaganda coming out of the Russian regime even, that they were going to destroy Ukraine and effectively said, like, if we can't have it, no one can.
Yes.
And so when you see this just sort of indiscriminate bombing and degrading their defense industrial capacity, that also fits alongside of that narrative. At the same time, there's breaking news this morning that's quite significant. I'm curious your take on this. There are 3 European leaders who are actually traveling by train to Kyiv to meet directly in Kyiv with Zelensky. Those are the leaders of the Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia. According to the New York Times here, they crossed into Ukraine this morning, hours after a series of loud pre-dawn blasts shook Kyiv. Now, on the one hand, obviously, that takes some courage. Obviously, it's a very bold sign and show of solidarity. However, it's also very dangerous. Kyiv is, a city that
constant attack. Those are all 3 of those countries are in NATO. I mean, those are NATO heads of state.
Right, exactly. So on the one hand, you're like, that's courageous, but also if anything happens to these leaders,
then we go to war.
We go to war. So, all for the sign of solidarity here, but this is an extraordinarily risky maneuver, not just for these individuals, these leaders of these, countries, Czech Republic, Poland, and Slovenia, but also for the world.
Yeah, wow, that certainly does change the life. I'm literally learning about it live here. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of international solidarity that's happening across the world stage. These NATO leaders, probably their safety would be guaranteed. I mean, look, if you're Russia and you're shelling that city when there's 3 NATO heads of state in there, you're crazy, because if a single one of those people dies, that's it.
Or even gets
nuclear war.
Injured.
Yeah, even injured is already like that's, akin to like the Archduke Ferdinand or whatever getting killed. That's it. That's the, domino that falls, and then the entire thing is going to go.
That's exactly what I thought of too.
On the other hand, it could be that this is a delegation not just of solidarity, but of a secret negotiation in saying, hey, look, like here's how we could work it out whenever it comes to NATO. Those 3 countries you just listed all share at least some border or former relationship with Russia, so they could also broker some sort of deal, or at least say, hey, we can give you some security guarantee even if you do say NATO. Obviously, there's a lot going on behind the scenes. Zelensky is doing a big soft power campaign. He's going to be addressing the U.S. Congress virtually. He's addressing the Israeli Knesset virtually. He'll basically take any, meeting that possibly can across the world. So I don't know if in and of itself it is an important thing. On the other hand, we do know, Krystal, from reporting that NATO is likely to have an unprecedented meeting sometime next week in Brussels, where President Biden would most likely attend. So this could be a prelude to basically going to have face-to-face talks before we have an actual meeting of all the NATO heads of state. Wow, that really is a pretty significant development.
Yeah,
I mean, I don't want to say that they're not brave, but that you're putting us in a dangerous situation.
You're putting the whole world in a dangerous situation. There are ways to show solidarity without creating such incredible risk here. And what they say they're doing is offering financial help to Ukraine. Seems like something you could do via Zoom. Also, the show of the European Union's unequivocal support is what this is about. So again, I mean, you have to admire the bravery. You have to expect that if they're going there, they feel like their safety is assured and can be more or less guaranteed.
I hope so.
But This is war. Nothing's guaranteed.
Right.
Literally nothing's
Yeah,
guaranteed.
I mean, a Fox News reporter was just, he was, injured yesterday.
That's
in the
exactly
city. And
right.
I know some of the people, specifically Trey Yanks, who's a reporter in Kyiv right now, and, I was looking and reading a little bit. What they were saying is there's no front line. The whole city is just constantly being shelled, bombarded, no matter where you are. So, it's not like they may even be intentionally targeted. Look, I would hope personally that there is some sort of deconfliction line where we call the Russians or they call the Russians and they say, hey, we're going to be there, and you know what happens if we die. So possibly there could be a ceasefire of some sort of that. I also wouldn't put it past them in order to try and fire around the city while they're there in order to send
just
a little bit of a message to them. But
that's right.
Yeah, wow, 3 NATO heads of state inside an active war zone. That's a big,
not a great
big
situation.
Development. I mean, hopefully, once again, we can look at the 2 data points that we had pointed to. Zelensky, in a couple of interviews of late, basically saying NATO is off the table. Russia changing its definition of demilitarization. That would, I believe, open up the door for some sort of diplomatic settlement where Ukraine agrees to give up the Donetsk Republic and the Luhansk Republic, as well as recognize Crimea, but then Russian forces withdraw. They get to save face and say, hey, we demilitarized Ukraine, and then they don't have to deal with a massive insurgency on their hands. At the same time, don't get your hopes up too much. This could just be the prelude, and then whenever talks fall apart, that's when things get really nasty. We're still very, very, very early in this conflict.
Yeah,
so
and that's one of the things that's
right
unusual here is that, the Russian propaganda is just so full of lies and complete fabrication of what they're even up to that's impossible to know.
They're changing it constantly.
It's impossible to know what their goal is or what their end game is.
Right.
So everybody trying to read the tea leaves on that.
It's a tough situation.
Yes, indeed. And to that point, let's go ahead and put A4 up on the screen. This is the Ukrainians emphasizing some of the shift in tone and tactics. This is from Ukrainian Pravda, basically saying, they've shifted more to talking about demilitarization.
Right.
That language about denazification has seemed to have lessened, which is good because that was just sort of like an open-ended attack on Zelensky or anyone that they saw as a Ukrainian nationalist. And then the last piece here is we reported yesterday there were talks between the Ukrainian delegation, Russian delegation remotely. And as that was going on, Russia continuing to attack. And we did not get any specific signs out of that meeting that there was progress. But as Saagar was saying, there are some little possible hopeful movements on both sides of the equation that, God willing, could potentially bring an end to this conflict.
Let's all pray for the safety of those heads of state.
Yeah, indeed.
This is going to be a very different show the next time that we do it.
Indeed. All right. So we also wanted to look at what is going on within the nation of Russia as these extraordinary sanctions start to bite. Let's go ahead and put up the first element, which is some of the reaction from Putin and from the Kremlin. Putin has signed a law to seize foreign aircraft and redeploy it for domestic use. This goes along with something that he had threatened, saying basically, listen, Western companies, if you're going to leave here, we're going to take your stuff. And this is the first instance where they seem to have acted on that. According to this article, it says Russian President Vladimir Putin has signed a law allowing Russian airlines to keep foreign aircraft for use on domestic flights. That's according to a Russian state news agency. This means that if they already were sort of leasing these foreign aircraft, they're now going to seize them and continue to fly them, even though those Western companies have pulled out of the nation. This doesn't completely solve their problem, though, because as you guys probably know, planes need a lot of maintenance. They need a lot of parts. They've got to be kept up to, perfect conditions. And so you have sanctions that forbid maintenance. They forbid updates, support, or the supply of spare parts for planes. And ultimately, as things degrade over time, that could pose a risk to passengers as well. At the same time, you see the Russian economy in fairly dire straits. Let's put the Yahoo News piece up on the screen here next. The IMF is the latest organization or analyst to say that a Russian debt default is no longer improbable. This is a direct result of our sanctions on Russia's central bank. They say their international managing director said on Sunday that it's no longer an improbable event. they are scheduled to pay $117 million on 2 dollar-denominated bonds on Wednesday. Now, if the country is unable to pay those dollar-denominated bonds, so they're supposed to be paid back in dollars, then they do have a 30-day grace period to make a payment before they are technically in default. Russia has said they're going to start paying their debts in rubles. But the bond doesn't allow Russia to pay their obligations in rubles, so even if they paid in rubles, they would still technically be in default. Of course, you know, they have been down this road before, and it is very ugly when a country defaults on their debt.
It's not good whatsoever. We also had a projection from Goldman Sachs that Russia's economy could shrink by 7% as a result of the Ukraine sanctions. And it's actually an interesting thing to contemplate. On the one hand, the way that we've been talking about it and considering it, we did drop a financial nuke, quote unquote, on Russia. On the same, and look, I don't want to diminish it, a 7% contraction in a Western developed economy is a catastrophe for your quality of life and for a lot. On the other hand, it's only 7%. Right? This isn't necessarily the same, you know, Treaty of Versailles or whatever type reparations that are being levied upon Russia. So in a way, I think we might actually have the worst of all worlds. We exhausted a lot of financial options with very little off-ramp. Their economy will contract by 7%, but they're still going to have 93% of their capacity. That's pretty good if you think about it relatively. Their industrial base remains intact. Yes, their trading relationships and all are down, but it's not like they're totally isolated. The Europeans continue to buy their gas and their oil. India and China also looking like they'll be willing to purchase some of their goods. So this is very much not a North Korean state. This is something that could conduct a limited type of business much more so than Iran. So maybe we just cut Russia off from the Western financial system. And now their economy, while yes, they're going to have to pursue, you know, high levels of autarky and they won't be Western anymore, they'll be a lot more like a traditional Eurasian power with, you know, a geopolitical relationship to the south and to the west, to the east. Anyway, all of this is a long-winded way of saying that we may have exhausted our entire financial playbook and not actually levied the amount of pain on Russia that a lot of people might think. I don't think that they're considering that 7%, while yes, is bad and very bad for the people who live there, it's not a catastrophe.
So to put it in, you know, understandable terms, I looked this up, and during the Great Recession, our GDP fell 4.3% from its peak. That was the largest decline in the post-war era. So we fell 4.3%. This projection is 7%. So you're talking about significantly worse than what was a whole lot of pain during the Great Recession. But I think to your point, it's survivable. And so what you've done is you've inflicted mass pain on the Russian public, who had nothing to do with this war, didn't ask for it. And you've created more incentive for countries like Russia and China and others to build an alternative financial architecture so that next time we go to use sanctions, they're going to have even less of an impact. And you are very unlikely with these measures to really accomplish anything in terms of your goals vis-a-vis Russia. In fact, if anything, and this is, you know, I've been talking to Igor Kotkin. He's a Russian socialist who is there in Moscow. And so he's able to give me a little bit of a perspective of how people are feeling there and what it's like in the city, at least. And according to him, and this bears out, you know, there are historical parallels, this is helping to ease some of the pressure on Putin and shift it to the West, because people do genuinely feel sort of under siege. They see the hypocrisy of, well, you guys invaded Iraq and we didn't sanction you. They see the sort of Russophobia hysteria that we've been tracking here. And so you really are, if anything, sort of making it more difficult to accomplish your goals or to persuade any slice of the Russian public that was ultimately persuadable. In terms of the vibe on the ground, according to him, he's, you know, said there's not like a mass panic. And partly that's because you have this very powerful state propaganda of like, we're all good, everything's fine. So there are some longer lines. Prices have gone up, especially in things like electronics. Things have skyrocketed like 100%. But there's been a lot of pressure to keep kind of essential like food and those sorts of goods at a reasonable price level. So there have been price increases, but not nearly to the level of things like electronics and things that are, just directly imported.
None of this is born from me being like, oh, we shouldn't punish the Russians at all. It's more about, well, what is the efficacy of what we are actually doing?
That's it.
And so, look, a 7% contraction, like I just looked it up when you were talking about the Great Recession. The Great Depression was a 30% contraction. So we're talking about a 1/3 of the Great Depression. Well, what exactly does that mean? And then also in the terms of the long-term prospects of Russia, but also, the domestic populace, which is that the hope was that you make life so miserable for the Russian people that they cause political problems for the Russian government. I don't think a 7% is going to do that. I just simply don't.
Well,
it's enough of a pinprick in order to make it hurt, but not enough in order to make you an existential crisis.
That was our strategy in Iran. It didn't work. That was our strategy in North Korea. It didn't work. That was our strategy in Cuba. It didn't work. So even if they were causing, 30, 40% GDP shrinkage, we just haven't seen a track record of sanctions being deployed in a way that is actually effective in accomplishing our foreign policy goals. And in the meantime, you are creating a lot of pain for, people who really aren't to blame here. You can, on the one hand, say, oh, it's just the Kremlin and the oligarchs who are in control of everything. The public really has no say. And then on the other hand, make everybody sort of complicit in their actions. So both from a moral perspective, there's an issue, but you could potentially justify it if it was going to bring an end to the war and if it was going to keep contagion from spreading.
I think it's an open question.
And so I think when you look at it tactically, you also find the strategy to be quite wanting.
Well, I just think that people should calibrate expectations, because if you were to ask your average person on the street, they'd be like, oh man, we threw everything we did. And I'd be like, well, what if I told you only contracted by 7% and that they're going to continue fighting and then build out this alternative ecosystem? They'd be like, well, I didn't know that. Is there any more that we can throw at them? Here's the answer. Not really. There's some, on the edges, but not to the point where if the Europeans are going to continue to buy gas, there ain't much you can do about that.
Yeah.
So when you put that all together, we might have just created a situation where they're going to be more autarkic and they're definitely going to suffer, but they still have the capacity, almost certainly, to run this war as long as they possibly need to. There's a lot of cope that I see online. Oh, Russia's folding. Listen, this is a great power. They got a lot of oil and they have millions and millions and millions and millions of people. Especially if you look at their history, if their backs are up against the wall, these people will fight literally to the death if you want to go and learn some of that. So I would never count out the Russian people. I think their capacity for suffering is more than any, possible civilization on Earth relative to everybody else. And so we just really need to consider
you deal
what
with
we're
winters
getting
like
into.
that every year, that creates a capacity.
Listen, I've been to the Baltics
suffering.
in the winter. I don't know how you people do it out there. It's just depressing.
There's one other piece of this that I want to introduce in the conversation, which is that our own financial system has made it much more difficult to go after the people who are actually complicit and to blame, which is Putin and his oligarchs. I mean, so many of these people, the way that they shelter their funds is using Delaware shell companies. And what's the other one? Is South Dakota that's now the big hotspot for laundering money and shell companies and hiding what you're doing. And so since we have, this country, made the financial system so opaque and so easy for people to hide their assets and hide their wealth, it makes it so that we have a lot fewer tools in our arsenal to actually go after the people who are complicit and who should pay a price and who should feel the pain. So that's another important piece of this. And of course, we haven't seen any movement from Biden or certainly the Republicans or anyone in Congress to change that system, to make it more transparent so that we could levy much more effective and direct sanctions, targeted sanctions.
Okay, let's go ahead and move on to China. This is obviously, again, a very important, geopolitical relationship, and how exactly everything is shaking out, nobody knows. Let's go put this first thing up there on the screen, which is that the U.S. has apparently told its allies that China has signaled an openness to providing Russia with military support from the Financial Times. Now, Moscow requested equipment, including surface-to-air missiles. Keep in mind, the Chinese deny this, the Russians deny it, and the Americans are leaking it from a State Department cable, and it's probably an authorized leak. So as to the actual efficacy and all of that of this, or the amount of truth involved in this is up for debate.
Yes.
That being said, what they continue to say from the U.S. side is that the Chinese have signaled a willingness to provide military assistance. If we were to read the tea leaves in relative to current U.S. policy, the U.S. and the Biden administration has seen it that before the Russian invasion, they declassified as much as possible in order to, basically remove the act of surprise from the Russians, and also to use it as diplomatic leverage against them.
And to undermine their propaganda domestically as well, yeah.
It's very likely that they're doing the exact same thing here, if the intel is true. So just because it was true once does not mean it's necessarily true. Again, always keep that in mind. The 5 different types of equipment that they're asking for: surface-to-air missiles, drones, intelligence and related equipment, ISR, armored vehicles, and vehicles used for logistics and support. Now, as we said yesterday, the Russians don't technically need any of this stuff. They're asking for it, very likely, in order to bolster the diplomatic ties between the two countries. The Chinese military views very fondly any military that it's fought side by side in. This is part of the reason that they have, they call them blood brothers with the North Korean army, because they look very fondly back at the Korean War, whenever they fought against the Americans, and there's a ties forged in blood, which is very important to them. The Russians obviously know this too, and they're probably trying to get at least some sort of similar type relationship from the Chinese, but China obviously has to walk a tightrope. And let's put this next one up there on the screen, because it just shows you how confusing the situation is. China, however, through its state media propaganda outlets, has signaled a disinterest in providing weapons to Russia for a brutal Ukrainian campaign. The reason that this matters is that all eyes were on Global Times, and specifically Hu Xixin, who is, an editor over at Global Times. I read Global Times all the time, and this is part of our reason we've been talking about state media, because I know that they specifically talk in English in order to try to signal us both their most diplomatic talks, but also kind of their most hawkish elements. And that's what Global Times is. It's like the attack dog of the Chinese Communist Party. So to see the attack dog himself say in this opinion piece that the Biden administration's move was arrogant, but that as a major military power, Russia does not need to ask China to provide substantial military assistance, he says this, quote, "Moreover, China is not obligated to promise nor to export arms to Russia," he said in a video. Now, this matters because if he's going to say that they are under no obligation to do so, and that they have no promise to do so, and that's the most hawkish element of Chinese state media, that in and of itself is a data point that we could point to and say, well, the official arm of the Chinese regime is saying, or at least pushing the public towards thinking that they don't need to do this.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that secret shipments may not happen.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that they may not have been like, yeah, maybe, but what are you going to do for us? So it's a complicated situation, but it would change the situation on the ground.
Yes. Well, let's parse the language here a little bit too. Another piece of what they say is, as a major military industrial power, Russia does not need to ask China to provide substantial military assistance for the limited scale war in Ukraine. Now, what we do know is the Chinese have previously provided Russia not with arms, but with supplies like tents, winter coats for some of their conflicts along their border. So, if you look at the U.S.'s wording, they talk about general military assistance. They don't specifically say arms. So you could read this as basically, in a certain sense, going together, as they may provide that sort of military assistance, things like supplies, tents, coats, those types of items, but not actually provide arms, which would be kind of consistent with how China has behaved thus far with trying to kind of straddle the fence.
Right.
Because the minute you provide actual offensive weapons, that's a very different thing than providing winter coats. So as I read this, that seemed like one potential possibility, But basically, we're just trying to present both sides of what's being said here. The Chinese are saying basically, no, the Kremlin, of course, is denying that they even asked, because it's very embarrassing for them that they would have to go to anyone at this point and ask for anything. This should have been, they thought this was going to be over in just a matter of days, and they still aren't making significant progress towards Kyiv. But, the White House saying that the Chinese did signal their willingness to provide military assistance. That's kind of very careful language, not saying when, not saying what, not saying how.
Right. And the U.S. National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, met yesterday with the Chinese foreign minister for 7 hours. We didn't get all that much of a readout necessarily.
No,
Let's
it
put this
was
up
pretty
there
limited.
on the screen. Yeah, like a tiny little paragraph in terms of what they're willing to tell us from a 7-hour meeting. Jake Sullivan met today with Chinese Communist Party Politburo member. Okay, I'm going to skip his title. In Rome, Italy. Their meeting, his title is half of the paragraph. Their meeting followed up on the November 15, 2022 virtual meeting. Mr. Sullivan raised a range of issues in U.S.-China relations with substantial discussion of Russia's war against Ukraine. They also underscored the importance of maintaining open lines of communication between the U.S. and China. So a whole lot of nothing that came out of that meeting, and we still, a whole lot of nothing in terms of what they're willing to tell us about that meeting. I would love to have been a fly on the room.
Oh, yeah.
The main thing that we also need to emphasize is that China is in a very precarious situation economically. They cannot risk even 1/10 of the sanctions that we've levied upon Russia. I'm going to be doing a lot more on this in my monologue as to what that means for us. But in terms of what it means for them, let's put this up there on the screen. It is total carnage out there on the Hong Kong Stock Exchange. They are having some of their worst days since 2008. They're having massive panic selling. Their stock equities here in the United States are down by like 70-something%. They have a major real estate bubble, all kinds of crazy financialization and short selling bets on the nickel markets. It's been kind of fun to watch. But yeah, just look at that graph for those of you who are watching. But they're falling off a cliff over there. They got themselves a big old problem in terms of speculation and financial markets. The CCP is trying to run in and backstop as much of the market as possible. But whenever we cover that Evergrande crisis, this is just a very similar kind of slow roll cascade to something that could be really, really bad. So just consider that they're in a precarious economic situation where if they were levied with some sort of sanctions or if their trade took a hit, boom, they're done, especially given the COVID situation with them right now. It would put them in a very, very, very tough situation. So it's an interesting development. China has to choose between being a Russian-aligned power explicitly against the West, even though they are, and we all know it. They haven't explicitly declared it so, and they still have reaped arguably more than anybody else the benefits of the Western international-led order.
Oh, no doubt about it.
On the other side, they could choose to keep with that because it's been so economically lucrative, kind of leave the Russians out in the cold and play some sort of diplomatic game. But whatever course they decide, if they do choose to broker a peace, that's a realignment of the global order. If they do choose to side with the Russians, well, everybody gear up because that's not going to be a fun 100 years for us to live in. And if they choose to side with us, then the Russians are definitely toast in the long run. So it's all three. They have become a great power, obviously, in their own right. And whatever course they choose will definitely determine the course of history.
Yeah, I mean, that's what was so significant about the essay that we brought you yesterday.
Oh, right.
From a state-aligned thinker that was basically making the case, look, we're trying to be neutral, and there is no neutrality.
Yeah, there's no neutrality.
That's just not a place where you can possibly stand. All of our actions, abstaining and the Security Council votes and those sorts of things are being interpreted as siding with Russia. So do we really want to be in this place of being part of the sort of pariah bloc of the world with, Europeans and the U.S. sort of more aligned, more united than they've been in a long time? Do we really want to be explicitly on the other side of that ledger? And I think that's what they're contemplating right now. And the reason we keep trying to read these tea leaves and trying to figure out as best we can and predict as best we can what they might do is because if anyone could end this conflict, it would be them. I mean, if they really put pressure on Moscow and pulled their support and we're not going to back them in this outrageous war, that would force Moscow's hand and force them to make some concessions at the table and hopefully be able to come to some sort of negotiated settlement. So they really are the key player in all of this for the immediate future, but also in terms of that longer term geopolitical alignment and understanding what the world is going to look like a year, 2 years, a decade from now. This is the moment.
Absolutely.
We wanted to bring you something that is absolutely extraordinary, which is that on the main live evening newscast in Russia, this is like their main news hour, Propaganda Central, a woman who worked at that station burst onto the broadcast with an anti-war sign. It's in both Russian and English. And she says, you're going to hear it in Russian, she says, "Stop the war. Don't believe propaganda. They're lying to you." Let's take a look at that.
Премьер подчеркнул, надо усилить сотрудничество в рамках союзного государства, а на совещании в правительстве обсуждали, как сохранить доступность лекарств.
So for those who are just listening, I mean, it's an amazing moment because you see the newscaster doing her thing in like a live newsroom, looks like cable news would here, and Swim bursts on in the background. She's got her sign, she's saying no to war, and then, that continues for like 2 seconds, and then they cut to some other image, and I'm sure pull her off of the set. She also released a pre-recorded statement, and by the way, the reporting is she has been detained, and Lord knows what her fate ultimately is going to be, especially with the new quote-unquote fake news laws that they have passed, allowing years of jail time for anyone who even calls this a war or an invasion. Let's go ahead and put this next piece up on the screen. So her name is Marina Avsyannikova, I'm going to go with.
Let's go with that.
I'm sorry
Russians.
guys.
Yeah.
Marina, she's the woman who ran onto that live state TV news broadcast. She recorded a message beforehand. In it, she says her father is Ukrainian. She calls for anti-war protests, and she says she's ashamed that she worked for Kremlin propaganda, and she denounces the war absolutely. There was a sort of informal translation that was floating around online, part of what she said. It was very well written and well delivered statement. She said, "We are Russian people, thinking and smart people. Only we have the power to stop this madness. Go protest. Don't be afraid. They can't put us all in jail." So an incredibly brave stand here by Marina, knowing full well what the consequences could be for her.
Yeah, she knew that she was going to be arrested. She literally said they can't arrest all of us. So that's just incredible to watch. And look, we shouldn't exaggerate and say that this is, the dominant feeling in Russia.
Right.
It's probably the minority feeling.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that there aren't good people who are speaking out against the war inside of Russia. And I think that is what is so compelling. At the same time, we should remember that there are now Russian-occupied cities inside of Ukraine, and they are not facing the, we'll be greeted as liberators that they thought. Let's go ahead and put this up there on the screen. This is just an image from the city of Kherson. There is no, this is obviously a photo put out by somebody who wants you to see it, but go ahead and put it up there. You can see this massive crowd just assembled there in the city square bearing the Ukrainian flag, and that's in a Russian-occupied city. That's the latest of the similar type of images. We have the same thing in terms of a video that continues to see people fighting really back against the occupation with some Russian soldiers who are getting very skittish. They are now facing the problems that we faced in Iraq. In Iraq, we took over a country with 150,000 troops. It was a cakewalk, as they predicted, and they were like, oh, now we have to run a country of millions of people. That's pretty scary. And they're meeting that fear right now. Let's go ahead and take a look at that video. So yeah, you can see that it's not a good situation. It's very jumpy. Things can pop off at any moment.
Yeah.
When it's like that, you have some 19-year-old conscript Russian kid. Like, what does he know what to do? Might get scared. Then you've got all of these these Ukrainian civilians who are going to be fighting back against this. Look, once again, it's difficult to find out. There's a blackout of internet and of electricity in some of these cities, so we don't have a full picture of what's going on. But any of these demonstrations, they pose a big problem to the Russians whenever it's happening. You only have, you can deal with it the way the Soviet Union did, which is arrest everybody, send them to a gulag. I don't think that works in the 21st century. Or, you're going to have to find some sort of peaceable settlement with the actual civilians. I don't really see that happening either. So they're in a tough spot.
Yeah, that was extraordinary, especially because it was happening in Melitopol, which is, that's a city where they reportedly kidnapped the mayor.
Right.
There's video of him being taken out with a bag over his head, and God knows what's being done to him now. And a Russian puppet mayor installed in his place, and so. Just to see people, going up to these soldiers with gigantic guns and fearlessly telling them to, exactly what they think of what they're doing. it is incredibly brave. It is incredibly courageous. And so, these are the people who really deserve to be highlighted, who are standing against this war and doing everything they can to stop it and bring peace. So we're going to continue to highlight those examples that we see because it really is heartening.
Yeah.
At the same time, we wanted to bring you some updates on the political situation here at home. There's a new polling previewing 2024 that we thought we would bring to you. That actually, it's in some ways not as bad for Biden as I thought it could be. Let's go ahead and put this up on the screen. So if you had a rematch, Biden versus Trump, at least according to this pollster, it would be effectively a tie, 44 for Biden, 44 for Trump. Now, if you had Trump versus Harris, he wins. If you have Trump versus Hillary Clinton, he also wins.
Right.
So even as lackluster as Biden has been, he still is probably the best that the Democrats have to offer. And by the way, this same pollster had asked the same question a month or so ago. And at that time, Biden had a little bit of an edge over Trump, so he's kind of faded somewhat. And, one thing that was interesting here in this particular poll is they dug into how people felt about his handling of Ukraine, and they were generally fairly positive. He got decent ratings there. But when you ask voters if they agree with the statement that, quote, Biden's mismanagement of the withdrawal from Afghanistan has emboldened countries like Russia and China to be more aggressive, 61% of voters agreed. And that is the line that you hear from Republicans all the time. And let me also say that type of sentiment is exactly why these wars last for so long, because every politician knows they're going to get hurt the moment that they do the the dovish thing and pull us out of a conflict. They are only ever rewarded really by the media for the most hawkish behavior. And so you see even now with some quite hawkish moves made by the Biden administration, still the drumbeat is always, you have to do more, you have to be strong, you have to do more. So I just thought that was an interesting note here. At the same time, the Biden administration is leaning all the way into this idea that inflation has nothing to do now with anything except what's going on with Russia. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Make no mistake, the current spike in gas prices is largely the fault of Vladimir Putin. It has nothing to do with the American Rescue Plan. Back to Wall Street. Wall Street estimated that the San Francisco Federal Reserve analyzed it, said the rescue plan contributed only 0.3% to inflation. 0.3%. That's coming from the Fed. Rescuing our economy didn't cause this problem, but we're working to fix it.
Putin inflation.
So here's the thing.
Good luck.
Look, he's right to say that the American Rescue Plan is not really the issue, but we all know that inflation and gas price rises were happening before all of this in Russia. So people aren't stupid. You got to level with them. I mean, they can handle a nuanced and complex situation. So I actually thought the messaging that he had before, like that he just had in the State of the Union about, hey, there are some people who want to deal with inflation by basically making you poorer so you can't buy anything. Right. That's not my plan. My plan is to actually build on our infrastructure and fix our supply chain and take these corporations to task. That is a much better message than what I think is, they're looking for this sort of cheap and easy ability to shirk any sort of responsibility here. And people know that Russia is obviously complicating the situation, making it worse. They thus far are willing to, engage in some financial sacrifice because they think it's going to help the Ukrainians. But I don't think that this is going to sell with the American people when we all know that prices have been going up for a long time.
I completely agree with you. It's not going to sell. The best inflation-tested message the Biden administration ever had, per their own internal polling, was that the best way to deal with inflation is to build more things in America again. True. And I'll be talking in my monologue specifically about how China's idiotic COVID-0 policy is about to make all of us a lot more poor, even though none of us actually signed up for that type of system. And just to give you an idea of how devastating this is, Republicans, for the Democratic Party and for Biden specifically, go ahead and put this up there, which is a Wall Street Journal poll, which is that non-white voters right now are the most likely to say that high inflation in the last 4 decades is triggering a major financial strain in their lives, and that is giving Republicans a massive edge with them relative to their previous position. Of course, it makes sense, which is that non-white Americans are disproportionately more likely to be poor. Inflation is a tax upon the working class and specifically upon the poor. Gas prices are a tax on rural working class Americans as well, all of whom are also likely to not be white. And you put that together with the fact that almost half of incomes less than $60,000 are reporting major financial strain, while just 13% of those making $150,000 are to do so. The current Democratic Party's base are those people between 60 to 150,000, the 135,000 crew to the 400,000 crew, the Weinwoms and all those people of America. When I say base, I mean the cultural base, not necessarily the voting base. These are the people traditionally who have voted for them, and they're all talking within these within the story. They're like, hey, look. He literally says, Uncle Joe has put us on a diet. I like to have a steak once or twice a month. I can't do that now. Stevens is a registered Democrat who voted for Barack Obama for president and then Trump in 2016. But he said he's more likely right now to back Republicans because of inflation. Look, the guy voted for Trump, so, take that with a grain of salt.
Yeah.
I would just say, though, that people don't fit the typical identity politics mold, and they're getting nuked by inflation. And the Biden administration, blaming it on big bad Putin, it's just not going to work, no matter what. You could say we're going to build things in America again, but guess what? He hasn't presented a single plan before Congress. Build back better. Imagine presenting before a major global crisis the exact same plan as you had before. What type of innovative thinking is that?
Well,
it's
that was
idiocy.
That was one of the things we talked about on the State of the Union night is like, okay, did you really scrap the old speech?
Right. No, you didn't.
Use this moment to bring people together and paint a portrait of how we're going to deal with this crisis and how we're going to come together as a country, make ourselves strong. We're going to invest in renewable energy, nuclear Green New Deal or whatever. Like, pull it together. And we're going to make things in America. I agree with you that would land across the board with Republicans, Independents, and Democrats. In fact, there's a dude who's quoted in this Wall Street Journal piece who's going to vote for Republicans who said exactly that. That he's like, I think the problem is that we don't make anything here anymore. I mean, this is something this is a nonpartisan populist sentiment that the Biden administration, like 2 weeks ago, started to sort of play with. And now they've just rejected it in favor of, it's all Putin's fault. So I don't think that this is a smart direction for them to go in. And I mean, you can't say enough what a missed moment and opportunity it is, because you do have people right now sort of really wanting to do something and recognizing the perils of the systems that we have built and how they have made us more vulnerable. And there is no effort whatsoever to kind of build on that current moment and energy and consensus to do anything. And so as a result, according to this poll, you have now Hispanic voters saying they would probably or definitely back a Republican candidate for Congress over a Democrat by a margin of 46 to 37 among Hispanic voters. That's devastating. And just back in November, when already there'd been a lot of Democratic erosion among this group of voters, the two parties were tied. They were tied, and that was considered a disaster. Now they're losing by 9 points. And by the way, there's also been some erosion among black voters. They favored a Democrat for Congress by 35 percentage points. That's still a lot, but that's down from 56 points that they favored Democrats back in November. So support for a Republican candidate among black voters rose to 27% when it stood at 12% in November. I mean, these are, like, Democrats can't win. Forget about the midterms. They can't win anything with these kind of numbers among working class black and brown voters. And so they better figure out something that is going to signal to these voters that they take their concerns seriously and they're actually doing something about it, not just trying to blame shift and treating you like an idiot that you didn't notice that prices were rising before now.
Yeah, I think that all those, so this is the thing about why are they having such a missed opportunity. They could actually propose something ambitious. And okay, let's say you want to break the logjam. The only way to do it is to put something that has actual bipartisan support and then dare, the Susan Collins, the Joe Manchins and all of them to vote against it without giving them any sort of excuse. I went ahead and checked. There are several Republicans on the record who are pro-nuclear power. I didn't know that South Carolina gets like half of its power from nuclear. They have all kinds of these power plants down in the South. Tim Scott is pro-nuclear. Okay, go to his office. Let's talk about it. I mean, there's all kinds of different things that you could try and talk about and then say, hey, Joe Manchin, you really going to vote against this? Really? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah.
You're going to deny clean, cheap power to the people of West Virginia? Be my guest. These are the types of things where when you would actually put them on the spot, it could change the whole map. And more importantly, you would show the American people you're trying to do something about it. But right now, look, there's been a temporary drop in gas price. Thank God. It's like, I think 10 cents, whatever, drop in the last couple of days.
Take what we can get.
Yeah, we'll take what we can get. It's still above $4 a gallon. Brent crude is going below $100 a barrel. There's a lot of different reasons for that. It could still spike up to $150. It remains unclear exactly what's happening. But people are paying a lot of money for food, for gas. These are all areas where we could have more cattle in America. Why do we buy all these cattle from Uruguay or whatever? Or why exactly do we have it so that, we're importing all this oil from Saudi Arabia, who we don't like, and we have to go hand in hand over to the king who slaps him in the face and doesn't even accept his phone call? Everybody's willing to have that discussion, but nobody's willing to give you an answer right now. And in that environment, the Dems are toast, and the alternative is always going to win, and that's the GOP. My warning to the GOP would be, though, if your message is do nothing about it, which is mostly what it is whenever you're in power, then good luck, because then the Dems are going to win.
Well,
and we have this endless cycle of nothing.
Their message in some corners is even worse than do nothing. If you're listening to the Rick Scott plan, your message is let's actually tax working class people. True. It's like a throwback to the whole Mitt Romney 47%, are the takers kind of nonsense. So good luck with that, y'all. See how quickly that changes these dynamics back in the other direction.
Yes. Okay, let's go ahead and move on. This is not just about The View. This is about a repulsive and disgusting McCarthyized sentiment, which is sweeping elite liberalism. At The View, it just goes to show you that elite liberalism is now being channeled into their popular cultural elements and trying to spread this message to the masses. So let's go ahead and start with this from The View, where they call for a literal investigation by the U.S. government into people who are questioning the official government narrative on Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
And look, but I think that's an incredibly relevant question. Yeah. And I think DOJ, in the same way that it is setting up a task force to investigate oligarchs, should look into people who are Russian propagandists and shilling for Putin. That's being, if you are a foreign asset to a dictator, it should be investigated. In fact, I remember when Tulsi Gabbard, and I even hate that we're discussing it because I think to myself, who is this woman?
They used to arrest people for doing stuff like this. If they thought you were colluding with a Russian agent, if they thought you were putting out information or taking information and handing over to Russia, they used to actually investigate stuff like this. And I guess now, there seems to be no bars. And people are not being told to hate Putin.
This is disgusting.
They used to arrest people for stuff like this.
And this started with Mitt Romney. Let's go put this up there on the screen. Who says, quote, Tulsi Gabbard is parroting false Russian propaganda. Her treasonous lies may well cost lives. Look, here's the thing. We don't know a goddamn thing about what's going on with these Ukrainian biolabs. And yeah, there's a lot of propaganda on both sides that are flying around about them. That being said, treason is a crime punishable by death. And that is what you were accusing a member of the U.S. Armed Forces of. Even worse, you can disagree with somebody without saying that they are a traitor to their government.
Yeah.
Look, we live in a free country with freedom of speech, where people can and should be allowed to basically say whatever they want. I will go as far as saying that if somebody is parroting straight up Russian lies, they should still not be prosecuted for treason.
Of course.
You know why? Because that's happened before in the Civil War and World War I and World War II and the Vietnam War. And in any of those cases, we were better off for having free and open discussion rather than, censoring any outright opinion that we don't agree with. That's the cost of living in a free society, and if you're actually confident in what you believe, then you don't have to go around accusing people of treason. So, like we said, regardless of the merits. To put this out there in the minds of millions of people is so incredibly dangerous. They're calling for the use of the state against their political opponents.
Insane. It is insane. And I recall, I seem to remember during the Trump 2016 campaign when, the lock her up chant, there was a lot of concern about, vindictive use of the state to criminalize your political opponents. And I would just say, yes, that was grotesque then, and it is grotesque now. What's really shocking is that you have this whole panel of women who are supposed to have, ideological diversity, and not one of them is like, hold on a second.
Like, hey, that's a little crazy.
Wait a second. Yeah. We're now casually calling to arrest Tulsi Gabbard and Tucker Carlson because they said some things we don't like. Like, what are we doing exactly here? And it does show you the way that liberalism and a desire to be on the right side of history and get it right with regards to polite society and be tougher and stronger with regards to doing the right thing, how that can quickly slide into, yes, authoritarianism and fascism. I mean, you see it really unfolding right now in real time, where some of the most grotesque xenophobes, people like Eric Swalwell, who are just casually calling to ban every Russian student from the country. People are calling for, banning any Russian ownership of anything and kicking 20-year-old piano players out of concert. I mean, this sort of mindset is really exposing something ugly and dangerous. So yeah, this is an extraordinarily bad direction for things to go in, where you can't handle someone saying something that you don't like, that you think is untrue, that you disagree with, that you think sounds a little bit like some other country. And so you can't handle that. You have to actually criminalize and jail them.
Yeah.
What kind of, again, we talk a lot about democracies around the world and being and believing in democracy. What type of a democracy is so self-conscious that you can't deal with a couple people having a different point of view and saying things that you don't like, even things that may be offensive, even things that may be completely wrong? You can't handle that. I also like the moment when she acknowledges, we're actually just giving this point of view more attention right now.
Yeah, well, yeah, you're
They
right,
do that all the time.
Yeah,
They did this with Trump, too, all the time. They're like, I can't believe we're talking about this. But then we're going to spend the whole show talking about this.
Yeah, and, of course, so many people are crawling out of the woodwork. Peter Strzok, you guys might remember him, the disgraced FBI agent who had an affair, and then all the texts, obviously, that were at the heart of Russiagate. Look what he put out yesterday. Let's put this up there. So he compares Tulsi Gabbard saying, quote, Ukraine isn't actually a democracy, to Tucker Carlson saying, quote, not that Ukraine is a democracy, and says, not are they coordinating, rather, who is coordinating? All right, look, you frickin' genius. It does not take a coordination to state the basic fact that, yeah, Ukraine is a corrupt country. Ukraine did have some problems in terms of corruption, crackdown on domestic political opponents, and more. And having an argument as to whether that's democracy or not, okay, that's fine. I think it's up in the air. But that should be part of the discussion, especially when people like him are saying that the United States has a responsibility, basically, to engage in war on behalf of that country. We should then talk, who are our allies? What do they really stand for? And obviously, it's a very gray area in all of this. And I don't think that the Ukrainians are, I'm not saying here that the Ukrainians deserved it. I'm not saying that the Russians aren't the bad guy in this situation. I think that they are. I'm acknowledging that life is very complicated, and they are accusing anybody who's even stating that basic fact, or sure, even in both of these cases, hyperbolizing it. That doesn't mean that they're being coordinated agents. Implying conspiracy also implies crime, and worse, it implies it has to be cracked down upon.
Yeah.
You put all of these together, and you're seeing a call for political, basically government violence and use of the state in order to criminalize any alternative opinion or explanation which should be allowed in a free and a vibrant democracy?
Is some real tinfoil hat kind of crap
Yeah, it's
that
just
Peter Strzok
it's low IQ. That's the other thing.
Yeah,
That's
is
dumb.
alleging here.
Right.
But everybody's primed, I shouldn't say everybody. There's a lot of the population that's primed for it after years of Russiagate conspiracy where you were seeing like a Kremlin agent and, you know, the hands of Putin manipulating every single thing that was happening in our politics and apparently, you know, in the Canadian trucker convoy as well. We brought you that too. I mean, listen, it's not hard. Engage with what they're saying. My issue is I don't know why there's a fixation on the democratic norms or lack thereof in Ukraine because it doesn't justify, like, I don't see how that changes the situation with what Russia is doing to Ukraine. So I do think the whole conversation is a bit of a distraction. But you can also just directly engage with it. You know, there is significant corruption. They are a sort of fledgling democracy. There have been troubling crackdowns on political opponents. There's been troubling crackdown on independent media. By the way, we can also say we've got our own issues with democracy here in this country and the will of the people not being represented. Is that hard? No, it's not. It's, you know, I mean, and we give these people we give people so much power by pretending that they're so important that we can't even allow them to have a voice or a platform whatsoever. We have to criminalize them. They have to be traitors. The penalty, I mean, is Mitt Romney saying that Tulsi Gabbard should be put to death? Like, this is literal,
what he's saying, actually.
Insanity and part of the mass hysteria, which is extremely dangerous that we have been tracking here as well. So there you go.
Yeah, that's right.
All right, Saagar, what are you looking at?
Well, when the history of the 2020s is written, they will look back at this month specifically as when the world truly woke up to the dangers of globalization. You would think it might take a global pandemic, 2 years of depending on your peer adversary for critical medical supplies, but really what it took was the outbreak of a war in Europe combined with a massive supply shock brought once again by the Chinese government. The Russian effects on the economy at this point are all well known. High gas price, high fertilizer price leading to food, and possibly double-digit inflation in food products for the developed world, as well as a very likely shortage in wheat markets. And while devastating as that will be for many people, it is just a drop in the bucket compared to what could come. Russia, after all, is only the world's 11th largest economy, and they mostly just export petroleum products. China, on the other hand, is the whole ballgame. Even 10% of the Russian economic sanctions against China would have a cascading effect on the global economy. And while sanctions haven't touched them yet, the idiocy of the Chinese Communist Party is about to have a massive impact on the global economy and us here at home. China, despite being responsible for the spread of COVID in the first place, has remained duly committed to COVID zero policy and has the authoritarian chops to back that up. So, they have instituted full-scale lockdown and quarantines across the country. They will even strand people with nothing in service of trying to shut down the virus. They had moderate success with that strategy until Omicron appeared, and now, when COVID zero meets Omicron, we are seeing a massive impact on our own supply chain for goods that we consume at home. Yesterday, we saw that news that the Foxconn has forced to halt production at its Shenzhen facility over a Chinese-imposed lockdown over the entire city. This has a massive impact. First, obviously, on the Apple iPhone supply chain. But more than that, it is a symbol of even more inflation to come here at home. Shenzhen has a population of 17 million. It is being shut down over 60 coronavirus cases. 60. These people make the Branch Covidians here at home look sane. The Shenzhen facility for Foxconn is the second largest facility in the whole country. Exactly how long is this lockdown going to last? Totally unclear. Look, according to the city of Shenzhen's own government, they are the largest exporter of goods from all of China, with 300 billion in goods just last year, with a large percentage of those goods related to consumer electronics, from phones, processors, audio, video equipment, basic electoral components. We are talking about one of the most strategically important cities on the planet for production that exists in the year 2021. Here's the thing. This lockdown on the city, it's totally up to the government of China when it's going to stop. They have not cared yet about economic consequences when pursuing this idiotic strategy. China is restricting intercountry travel, keeping millions of its citizens restricted to the areas that they are from. And in a way, I feel for them. China has not actually done a very good job of vaccinating their elderly population, and they have a very, very vulnerable elderly population health-wise. Combine that with reverence for the elderly in China, and you see a government with more incentives to keep lockdowns forever. Of course, the casualty is going to be the U.S. global inflation in terms of consumer electronics. It's now even more likely to spike, highlighting the dangers of globalization and allowing a critical part of your supply chain of the future to be wholly determined by the whims of a government which also loves nothing more than to see our country suffer. What's worse is that inflation is only likely the tip of the iceberg. Just yesterday, the Chinese stock market plunged more than it has since 2008. It is being described as a dot-com level bust over there. Because of our policymakers, we are likely to see financial contagion here at home. Multiple Chinese companies are included in funds traded by major stock exchanges, including some held by the most prestigious pension funds here in the US. Great, right? Yeah, totally great. In fact, Wall Street upped its investments in Chinese stocks last year. They were returning well relative to our markets, right? Yeah, except yesterday they are now down a combined 72% on US exchanges. Yeah, you heard me right. We are on the verge of what feels like a collapse of a global order, a financial order, but really an order of our lives. We have ordered our economy around the cheapest and most efficient stuff in the chase of endless profits. In some areas of life, that's nice. The iPhone is cool. My flat screen TV is cool too. But you know what's not cool? Paying nearly $5 a gallon and now having a huge portion of the public unable to afford the comforts of the everyday life that they were promised, and also being threatened with legitimate poverty over inflation. This is a turning point, but the problem is that there is no one to turn us in the right direction. Biden is absent. Leaderless. His successors and subordinates are perhaps the only people in Washington more clueless and useless than he is. And on the other side, just full-scale culture war. Nobody is proposing the ambitious program America needs to get ourselves the hell out of this mess. Look at our own eyes at the state of the world. Has there ever been a better time to build here in America? Develop long-standing plans in our energy policy, at least a call to the better angels of our nature to avoid war and have a prosperous peace? To make the pitch that we squarely to the American people, our 30-year experiment with being reliant on others is over. It's time to turn to ourselves. Unfortunately, we are missing this opportunity. And in the meantime, the people who will suffer most are working class Americans getting hammered at the pump, losing 7% of their wages to inflation, planning on driving less, and being miserable at home. Soon, they won't be able to get a new TV to at least relax while watching their economy collapse. In pursuit of becoming a rich country for the few, we have made our poor more vulnerable. All we can do at this point is to at least have the courage to admit that we were terribly wrong years ago and reverse course on globalization. I would say that we don't have a choice, but actually we do. It seems that we refuse to take it. Instead, we have chosen to be complacent and fake anger about whatever the next controversy of the day is for now. And unfortunately, that will probably doom us. That's really all I can look at the situation. I mean, 2008 crash in China. Okay, great. What could go wrong? 72% decline. Nobody here seems to be talking about it. It just seems a given. I mean, you and I had this problem on the most micro scale. That computer out there that we needed to process our show took like 3 months to get here. I mean, cars right now. Good luck buying a new car if it's got some expensive like semiconductors or whatever in it. Now, make that a year, 2 years. Same with the iPhone. I mean, iPhone just rolled out new phones. What are they going to do? They're not making them. So there's going to be a shortage. There's going to be price increase. I mean, these things sound trivial, but these are the backbones of modern life in the United States. And now they're gone.
A couple things.
Yeah.
First of all, this was all sold, this whole globalized direction of the economy, shipping jobs overseas, degrading our industrial capacity. All of that was sold on the promise of low prices. And now here we are.
And comfort and ease.
Not getting low prices, okay?
Right.
So that should expose just how hollow this is. Not to mention, I think it's a really empty direction that has actually corrupted America in like the most sort of like spiritual sense to view everybody as a consumer and basically nothing more. So that's one piece. The other piece that I've been thinking about is, we were also sold the notion that all of this interconnectedness would bring about peace, would help to, foster democracy in places like China and places like Russia. That obviously hasn't worked, especially in terms of democracy. But also, I think there's an argument to be made on the other side that actually if you're more self-reliant and if you have more native capacity, it can bring about peace because you don't have to worry so much about what these other countries are doing. And so that is less likely to lead to conflict where you have all these interests invested, critical, vital, interests at the core of what the public needs for just going about their daily lives vested in these other countries. Well, that's more likely to lead to tensions and lead to conflict. So I think that it may have been exactly the wrong way around the way that we were thinking about some of these things.
Oh, 100%. I mean, there was actually an argument I was reading recently. In the build up to the First World War, there was a very influential pamphlet which was distributed, which says, war is impossible. We all depend upon each other. The world is globalized. The telegraph. We can talk to Washington in 2 hours. This was over 100 years ago. The same argument. It was globalization. It's made it so that attacking upon ourselves would make us poor and would sacrifice millions for nothing. Yeah, it still happened. That's the whole point. And yet we fail to learn it again and again and again and again because you chase a dollar, in the interim, and it seems like a fine idea. Everybody can delude themselves. And then you wake up one day, you don't make anything here. Everything in this studio, the cameras that we're talking to, all probably made in China. It would be impossible for us. That's just on a micro level, but this is about the whole country unable to build stuff that they need, and we never learn our lesson.
Indeed.
Krystal, what are you taking a look at?
Well, guys, Joe Manchin really does seem to lean into a just cartoonishly villainous persona. Not content with taking a bunch of corporate cash to sink the climate provisions and Build Back Better, now he's coming after any and all attempts to lean into electric vehicles. So here is the latest. Speaking at an energy conference in Houston, Manchin told the crowd, quote, "I'm very reluctant to go down the path of electric vehicles. I'm old enough to remember standing in line in 1974 trying to buy gas. I remember those days. I don't want to have to be standing in line waiting for a battery for my vehicle because we're now dependent on a foreign supply chain, mostly China." This kind of anti-logic is enough to make your brain explode. I hated gas lines, so let's stick with gas forever. And yeah, because of free market ideologues like yourself, China has jumped ahead of us in terms of securing the resources and manufacturing capacity that we need to build our domestic electric vehicle market. Maybe spend some time on that in your position as a United States Senator rather than carrying water for the oil and gas lobby all day, every day. So, Manchin lays out this galaxy-brain position of prioritizing the terror of hypothetical battery charging lines instead of the actual gas lines that we've experienced. Or perhaps maybe he might be terrified of the obscene gas prices that the American working class is just outright unable to afford right now. Or maybe the way our gas addiction keeps us tethered to terrible regimes like the Saudis, or I don't know, the terror of climate devastation which the country and the world is already experiencing. But okay. If the imagined battery lines are your waking nightmare, you'd think that you would be into investing in electric charging stations to avoid such a calamitous and horrible fate. Nope, he's not down with that either. Manchin told the Houston Energy audience that he had a, quote, hard time understanding such investments, saying, "I've read history, and I remember Henry Ford inventing the Model T. But I sure as hell don't remember the US government building filling stations. The market did that." The crowd reportedly erupted with applause. Manchin's comments are not just absurd, though. They're also extremely depressing, because Joe Manchin is so much more than one politician bought off by the oil and gas industry, relentlessly pushing their propaganda. He is a living, breathing reminder of the fact that our security, our economic fate, and the fate of the whole planet are all tied to the actions of oil companies and their money. And it's a reminder that their interests have a stranglehold on our politics. It's a disaster, and one that has been made even more clear by our current predicament. As you probably know by now, here's the landscape. Now, you might have noticed gas prices in the US are at record highs. As I write this, yesterday, Americans were paying $4.33 per gallon. Our ban on Russian oil is not likely to help. In terms of other countries increasing output to lower cost, Saudi and the UAE are not taking our calls. Venezuela is still under sanctions and has degraded capacity anyway, and the renegotiation of the Iran nuclear deal is teetering on the brink of collapse. So how about our own domestic production? Well, these guys are certainly raking in record profits, so they could drill baby drill if they wanted to, but they don't. Exxon, Chevron, and Shell are among the 24 companies posting soaring profits in 2021, but uninterested in investing in increased production, instead padding the bank accounts of mostly already wealthy shareholders while you suffer at the pump. So, we got a situation where in the short term, we actually need these oil companies to produce more, and they won't. And then in the long term, we need them to produce less, and they also aren't going to do that. They're happy to engage in profit-maximizing capital strikes like what they're up to right now, but any transition away from utter deadly reliance on their product leads to an all-out offensive to kill any and all alternatives. They use their paid-off proxies, people like Joe Manchin, to prevent any sort of green options, even to the extent of bizarrely making the case against obvious infrastructure investments like upgrading the grid to accommodate more electric vehicles and electric charging stations. So, what would a policy suite look like that could incentivize short-term production but disincentivize long-term production? Well, we talked to an economist yesterday, Skandar Amarnath, about his plan, and it's got some things to recommend it. Use the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to smooth oil prices so that oil companies aren't afraid to invest now. Use financing mechanisms to further incentivize that investment. Use the Defense Production Act to deal with supply chain issues that are also holding back that short-term investment. But this doesn't really address the other side of the equation. Now, I can come up with lots of oil company bribes that might get them off their duff now in the short term, but how do we get them to accept a managed decline later on when they are so gigantic and so powerful and so profoundly uninterested in anything other than their own profits? Oftentimes, the simplest answer is the correct one. If people are poor, you give them money. If they're sick, you give them care. If they're homeless, you give them housing. Rather than tweak and incentivize and hope to drive the result we want, we should nationalize the oil companies and directly achieve the outcome that we want, the outcome which is in the best interest of the American people for today and for tomorrow. As I mentioned yesterday, Matt Bruning of the People's Policy Project, he recently laid out the logic. He wrote, private owners and investors are not in the business of temporarily propping up dying industries, which means that they will either work to keep the industry from dying, which is bad for the climate, or that they will refuse to temporarily prop it up, which will cause economic chaos. A public owner is best positioned to pursue managed decline in a responsible way. It's funny, Fox News' Harris Faulkner, of all people, actually came the closest, accidentally, to making the direct case for this of anyone on cable news. Take a listen.
I think you're talking about red tape. And when I hear you say that, I think about one thing. Operation Warp Speed. Come on, we can do this. We did what the rest of the world couldn't with the last administration in Operation Warp Speed. We wiped away that red tape. And I say we as Americans, right? And then we got vaccines, plural. Why can't we do that with oil?
Yes, Harris, get the government directly involved. Really own Biden by taking it one step further and call for outright nationalization. Let's do it. Now, her comments are instructive because they actually reflect the fact that gas prices and oil production are a direct and vital interest of the American people. Energy production should be seen more like vaccines or public safety or, frankly, the internet. Essential public goods, where the public's interest is frequently at odds with the dictates of profit maximization. The sort of thing that shouldn't just be left to the whims of private profiteers, but should be accountable to a democratic process and shepherded by a public owner. Production could be managed to smooth costs and set to decline over an achievable, realistic time horizon, all the time socking profits away so that the workers who are sure to be decimated by the industry's decline will be protected. Now, if you go to Senator Joe Manchin's home state of West Virginia, you'll actually see what the alternative looks like. It looks like ecological devastation and economic desperation. The failing coal companies, they left workers sick and they left them impoverished. The hillsides and the mountains stripped. The political system thoroughly captured and blocked possibilities for alternative economic development in order to hold that workforce captive. Now, do I think that oil company nationalization is likely? Even in this moment, when it's so clear that our nation's security, economy, and livable future are in the balance and that they are such incredibly villainous actors? No, of course not. It's socialism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But you know, UBI was once seen as fantastical, and it barnstormed its way into our suite of policy tools pretty quickly, so I guess, who knows? After all, nationalizing the gas companies would be a great way to own the neolibs, and if that can't bring us all together, I just don't know what can. The Joe Manchin comments were so profoundly depressing to me because it just shows you how captured the political system is and how, you know, even if we solve this like one short-term problem of, okay, how do we convince them to produce more, which would probably involve throwing even more subsidies at the oil companies, then you're just making them even more powerful, and what are we doing about them in the long term? So it's just kind of a disaster.
I think the actual core problem problem right now is a trust deficit, which allows corrupt actors like Manchin to undermine the public trust on this. For example, actually, Skanda made a comment on this yesterday. He was like, well, the best state-run oil company is in Norway. You know why? Because they don't really have a lot of disagreements in Norway. Everybody's Norwegian.
Well,
and they have a lot of
consensus. I actually was thinking about that too, because if you look at the list of the top oil-producing countries in the world, almost all of them, including us, are very corrupt. And Norway is the outlier. And it's partly a chicken and egg thing because in part, they have a very homogenous population, and so that makes it easier to start with. But then in part, you also have the oil companies nationalized, and so they haven't captured the government. And so that leads to less corruption. So when you're already in this situation, you're right, it makes it very difficult because Manchin also, the thing that he sort of capitalizes on and why he's able to, it's not popular among anyone to oppose electric vehicles. This is in no way representing like the interest of West Virginia. Elon Musk, to his credit, has made electric vehicles very popular among Republicans as well. But he's able to sort of posture against Democrats, and just by taking an oppositional stance,
that's what I'm talking about.
It doesn't really matter what the substance of what he's saying is, and that it's dramatically unpopular and stupid and awful on its merits because everybody's just interested in like owning the libs and owning the Democrats.
Yeah, and I think that, but I do think that the elite distaste is part of why there is such deep suspicion about this. So, for example, I see a big movement on right now. Be like, these idiot Americans buying SUVs. It's like, hold on a second. Americans get to drive whatever car they want. Now, if people control the oil company, well, what's going to happen? I mean, if those people run the government, they're going to make it so you can't buy big cars anymore. This is America. Actually, we have a huge country, and we are allowed to drive big cars if we want to. You could disagree with me if you want, but I believe in a lot more on the personal freedom. So what it comes down to is that they don't feel that there is that guarantee whenever it comes to government production. Even if they will always take freedom and the absence of complete and total control, as long as there is no absolute guarantee in the way that we have the Bill of Rights and other areas, that the government is unable to impose an actual social pro forma experiment upon you, a la gas prices. Or even the other way, right? Like if you had an administration that came in and tried to rig the market on behalf of SUVs or something, that would be wrong too. So I just look at it as it's a trust problem, which is that it's not going to happen because Americans don't trust their government. They probably shouldn't, in order to not use it for nefarious ends, especially in the year 2021.
Yeah, no,
that's really what it is.
I think that's right. And unfortunately, the government is the only entity that we have that can help us collectively navigate these crises, whether it's the current crisis with Russia and Ukraine, whether it's the healthcare crisis, whether it's the gas price crisis, whether it's climate change. And so that lack of trust leaves us in a disastrous status quo, effectively free fall, because there is no other real alternative.
That's why I was a fan of the Skanda thing, because I'm like, I think this thing actually happened. I was like, I think this could actually drop the oil price, which at this point, that's all I care about. I mean, you're seeing these poor people out there who are just getting hammered at $4 or $5 a gallon. It came out yesterday, the AAA survey I was talking about. People are already talking about driving less.
Yeah,
I mean, how can you take,
that was
you're taking away the most basics of people's lives.
We talked about too, said, when we'll see prices drop is for the most awful reason, because people just will stop driving.
What are they going to do? Just sit at home and do nothing?
And you have people who, rely on people most dependent on cars for transportation are overwhelmingly working class because they can't afford to live in the city because the cities are too expensive.
How many people do you know who are poor who drive 2 hours? A lot of people do that. A lot. 4 hours or so a day. This is not a joke.
Yeah,
it's really
absolutely.
bad.
And our public transit is shit, so just a terrible situation. All right. We have a wonderful guest we want to get to. You know him, you love him, the one and only Matt Taibbi. Let's get right to it. Joining us now, the man behind TK News, Matt Taibbi himself. Great to see you, Matt.
Good to see you, man.
Good to see you, Krystal. Saagar, how are you doing?
Very well. Let's go ahead and put your latest piece that we were all reading up there on the screen. You say, Orwell was right. From free speech to spheres of influence to our passion for endless war, we've become the double thinkers 1984 predicted. So, Matt, just give us your kind of overall view of how the war is being received and talked about here in this country.
Yeah, I mean, I read this book every time I get really, really depressed, and
does it make you more or less depressed when you read it?
It goes both ways, but in this case, I was really thinking about the sort of effortless way in which we switched from being completely enraged about the unvaccinated to feeling to moving all of those emotions over to the Russians, and about the succession of panics that we've had in the news in the last 5 or 6 years especially, and what that's done to the national character, and how similar that is to what Orwell was describing in 1984, where essentially he was saying that the ritualistic expressions of anger were designed to sort of keep people constantly in the present and to make them forget the past in any context that might be important to remember. And I think that's kind of what's going on with this Russia thing. They want people to not think about a whole variety of background issues involving this story. And it just seems like everybody's in this kind of 2 minutes hate mode about the entire issue.
Yeah, I think this is important, Matt, which is that this kind of freak out that we're seeing, and I'd like for you to bring your perspective as somebody who lived in Russia at the most critical time, really, of modern Russian history, where everything seemed up for grabs. You had these rapacious oligarchs, and then there's a massive financial collapse, but then now everybody has blue jeans and McDonald's. I mean, in the context of people there who you know, probably some of your friends, you can still read or keep in touch with them, how is this kind of Russophobia, kind of 2 minute hate madness, how is that going to play over in Russia, given the trauma that they have been through over the last 25 years?
I think for ordinary Russians, the idea that they're going to be held responsible for the insanity of their leaders it's nothing new. On the one hand, they're used to it. But on the other hand, I think that it's profoundly disappointing. And it's the end of a 30-year story about their disenchantment from the West. You know, when I first got to Russia it was still the Soviet Union in 1989. And when I studied there, I lived there for almost a decade. When I first got there, Americans were held in the highest regard. If you had a blue passport, you wouldn't have to pay for a drink anywhere. Everybody was anxious to meet you, and everybody was so interested in the West and wanted so badly to be part of the democracy and the sort of capitalistic plenty that they've been told about. They had all listened to VOA, and then over the course of the 90s, especially when shock therapy was imposed in Russia, there was this steady disenchantment with what the West was up to in that part of the world. And I think, what Putin was really, his popularity grew out of the fact that he was the first Russian politician of that era to stand up to the West. Now, I'm not excusing that. I'm just saying that's part of the explanation for his popularity as opposed to Yeltsin.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting what you just said there, because you said there was an enthusiasm for like the capitalistic plenty. That's what we were sold, like the McDonald's in Moscow and the blue jeans and Coca-Cola and all that stuff. Yeah. But that there was also an enthusiasm for democracy. Didn't get that part so much. What happened? Why was I basically know the answer, but I want to hear your perspective. Why was the capitalism part, that part was fulfilled, but the other piece of the openness and the democratic reforms that would give ordinary Russians more of a voice in society right now, how did that fall apart?
Well, I think it's actually tied to the economic part. There were two really important moments in the 90s. There was the referendum in 1993, which a lot of international organizations agreed was fixed in favor of Boris Yeltsin. It was very close either way, but he likely actually lost that election. Then there were, in between 1993 and 1996, 97, there was a series of privatizations where companies the size of Exxon and Microsoft, they were basically handed to cronies of Yeltsin for pennies in the dollar. And this instant oligarch class was created with our help. We heavily advised in the process of designing these privatizations. There was, in particular, a series of auctions called the Loans for Shares auctions that helped create the oligarchs that we hear about so much in the news. And we were instrumental in helping design those processes. And what happened in the wake of those privatizations is that essentially there was a backroom deal that these people were going to be handed these companies and gifted enormous wealth in return for bankrolling Boris Yeltsin's political career and making sure that he prevailed in the 1996 presidential election. And so a lot of Russians, they saw that there was this instantaneous, massive wealth gap. In a way, Russia was really a preview of what would happen in much of the West later. There was the discontent that we see in America and over Brexit and places like that, this idea of anger about the wealth gap and elites. Russians started early down that road in the mid-90s because of the way that society was designed in the wake of communism. We were so intent on smashing the old model that I think our advice helped create a kind of warped, almost like a parody style of American capitalism.
See, I think this is very important because a lot of people just don't really know that much about Russia. They don't really understand how a guy like Putin is even popular in the first place and how his worldview, which, look, at the extreme, the paranoia and the restoration of the Russian Empire, is rooted in a popular sentiment within Russia, which is, we got screwed by this whole deal. And that is what gives him the power in order to enact perhaps his most outlandish efforts within the country. I guess from our perspective, Matt, is there anything that the West can do in order to restore good relations with the Russian people? I mean, like, how would we go about that if it were to even exist?
Yeah, it's a little late now, I think. Which is too bad because I think there was an enormous opportunity for Russia to at least be a strategic and economic partner. Even as late as the late 90s, early 2000s, I think that possibility was still there. People also forget that Putin was originally brought in to the government by Boris Yeltsin primarily because he had helped secure the flight abroad of his former boss, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Anatoly Sobchak, who was one of the most famous early Democrats in Russia. And Yeltsin was impressed by the fact that that Putin had helped this guy escape prosecution on corruption charges. And so Putin was really brought in initially to help make sure that Boris Yeltsin would not be pursued on corruption charges because he was facing them at the time when he left office. Now, after he became president is when he sort of turned on the West. But initially, he was one of ours. Like he was a person that most of the people, the Western commentators, the Western politicians, the diplomats in town. I mean, I was there during this time. The expats, they all were saying things like, well, yeah, he was in the KGB, but by the 70s, the KGB wasn't so bad. That was kind of the attitude. And then suddenly, obviously there was a big sea change about that a few years after he assumed the presidency, but not initially. I mean, there was like a 3 or 4 year period there where Putin was considered a good guy by much of the American population in town, or at least a significant portion of it.
Right.
I want to get your reaction to this poll that I saw floating around. It's from YouGov, and they asked the question, which do you think best describes Russia? 42% said communist, 13% said socialist, 11% said capitalist, and 17% said something else. What do you make of that, Matt? That was basically what I made of it too. It's so depressing.
I mean, this is like the whole. Remember that Donna Brazil tweet?
What was it?
She was Donna Brazil. She tweeted something about how the communists are still dictating the terms of the debate. This was during the Russiagate mess.
Oh my god.
Yeah, no, there's tremendous. It's almost like this archaic hangover from the Cold War era, and people have a really difficult time grappling with the idea that Russia and the Soviet Union are different countries. And and that the people there are, there hasn't been communism in Russia in a long time, and Putin, although he has some nostalgia for the Soviet Union, he's not communist in any way that would
He doesn't want to be communist.
He doesn't want to be communist.
He likes the
exactly.
power of the Soviet Union and the world prestige and the sort of imperial nature of it.
Exactly. But certainly not any of the economic aspects of it are not attractive to him. He's a nationalist. He's sort of a classic Pinochet style, sort of nationalist strongman is what he is. But the communists, no. And it's kind of amazing that people that percentage of Americans still think that way. But I guess they do.
Use then the example of what happened in Russia, and then bring it to our example here at home. We have calls now by popular figures, politicians, to jail or call treason political opponents, any questioning of the official narrative, a total crackdown on state media, on channels, which, look, I mean, we find it useful personally to find, as a newscaster, to say, hey, this is what they're saying, this is what we're thinking.
This is the Russian propaganda.
This is the Russian propaganda, like, just so you're aware, but this is what they think, and that could help you then calibrate. When you see all of this happening in the context of your experience in Russia and watching the crackdown and all of that happen, are you afraid? Like, what do you think the consequences of this could be?
I'm very afraid. I'm made very nervous by it. I was in Russia when Putin really accelerated the crackdown against the media. It actually started much earlier under Yeltsin. As early as 1994, there were important investigative reporters in Russia being killed by like exploding briefcases and things like that. There was a guy named Dima Kholodov who was killed. But then in 1989 and 1990, when Putin came on the scene, there were friends of mine who worked at places like Novaya Gazeta who were beaten, and then eventually a couple of them were even killed for looking into things like the apartment bombing scandal. And at the time, there was a small minority of us who were saying this is a really bad indicator of what this regime is going to be like. He's already beating and cracking down on the media. He's closing up companies like Media Most, which was owned NTV, which was the last sort of independent news TV station in Russia at the time. Now he's gone full bore into this much more extreme version of controlling everything, or trying to control everything, outlawing the use of the word war, for instance, to describe what's going on in Ukraine. And I would think, looking at this as an American, that this would be a way for us to sort of evaluate our own values and say, wow, this is what we don't want to be, right? Like we don't want to be Vladimir Putin, who's so desperate to control every piece of information that we're cracking down on everything. And that's kind of what we're not seeing. I think what we're seeing instead is this desperation to use every tool imaginable to make sure that, not only the Russian point of view, that Russian state media is not seen, but that individuals may not even express or even relay what the Russians are saying about a certain thing. And it's amazing to me that Americans don't even see the logical connection between something like outlawing BBC and VOA in Russia and taking RT off the air in America and Europe. Like they don't see a connection between that at all. It's amazing to me.
Why do you think we haven't seen that reaction of sort of like reaffirming our commitment to free speech and the freedoms that we have, enshrined in our Constitution and the Bill of Rights that, have been cherished on the left for many years? Why don't you think that we see that effect? And instead we see this, I just saw your tweet, Keith Olbermann apparently saying like it'd be a good thing to put Tulsi Gabbard on trial or whatever. We covered the
military detention.
Yeah, we covered the Women on the View just casually being like, we used to arrest people for saying things like this. Why has that been the kind of polite society reaction to anyone who says anything that kind of is uncomfortable for them. And even, listen, I mean, in our history, you're supposed to accept even things that are completely wrong, completely offensive, all of those things. That's what free speech is all about.
Yeah, obviously that's the American tradition, right? Is if you don't believe in free speech for the person you most despise or most disagree with, you don't really agree in it with it in principle. Yeah. And this is what we've seen throughout this entire episode: is this idea that we have to. It's almost like it's been enacted without question. Like, it stands to reason. Obviously, we have to shut down RT and Sputnik. And first of all, I don't think that's actually a propaganda win for the United States. I think if you had left RT on, it's at best a wash propaganda-wise. It may even convert some people away from the Russian cause to leave that channel on. During this time period. But I think it just reflects overall a change in the cultural values of kind of the upper class political culture right now. We don't have a strong belief in civil liberties anymore. That's not really part of the liberal left's thinking on a lot of issues. And that was another thing I was amazed about by rereading 1984, was to see that, Emmanuel Goldstein was villainized because he was always talking about freedom of speech.
That's right.
And I remember reading that book as a kid and thinking, how could that make him the bad guy? And now all of a sudden it makes sense. It's like, it's incredibly creepy.
You're living it, Matt.
Yeah, you're living it, man.
Exactly. So are you.
True. Yeah. I just don't read the comments.
In this context, it's just so difficult, right? Because let's take that example, like you said, of showing people Russian media. Krystal listened to an interview with Maria Butina on BBC, where she was like, the Ukrainians are bombing themselves. I actually feel like people should hear that, right? You be like, this is the repulsive stuff that they are telling you at home. Listen to it for yourself. Take a listen. And instead, we've enacted this social media policy and YouTube policy and more, which bans anything that would even play a clip of that, even if we were to say, look how completely bonkers what's happening over in Russia is. In that context, we are completely locked into, Matt, a singular information environment. And can you just give us the insight into the dangers of that, given what happened in the war in Iraq and also with Russiagate? Like the actual democratic small d effects that has on the U.S. populace to live in this bubble that we're in right now.
Well, there's always that danger of the kind of the Streisand effect when you completely tune out some other point of view. It always makes it more attractive, more interesting. People always want to see the forbidden thing, and there's always this belief that, well, if the authorities are cracking down on it, if they're afraid to let us see it, there must be something to it. And there must be something that they're afraid of. So therefore, I'm going to go to the extra mile to go looking for it.
Right.
And this was very much the experience, by the way, of the Soviet Union, which cracked down so extraordinarily on media in their country that nobody read the official newspapers. Like, I didn't know I was still there during the Soviet time. Nobody actually read official newspapers. They were only used for things like insulating your walls or, lining bird cages. Like the newspapers were absolutely unreadable. But saying, the samizdat, the stuff that people passed around, that was a little before my time there, but there was still a little bit of it by the time I got there. You could still, but that was the only stuff people read, was the stuff that officially you weren't supposed to read. And I think that effect is very powerful. This idea of when you forbid something, you give credence to it, and that's exactly what we're not trying to do here. I totally agree with you. Like showing the Butina clip, would have exactly the opposite effect of what the Russians would want. But if you prevent people from seeing it, A, they resent that, and they start to have feelings about the people who are preventing them access to information. And then B, they're just going to be more inclined to to be sympathetic to that other point of view, and that's the problem with cracking down on speech is that it's not a zero-sum game. Like it really does ultimately bend against the person who is trying to control information, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. There was another interesting moment on BBC, a separate time that they had like a Kremlin propagandist on. It was a very combative interview. And then right after that, the host brought on some sort of American scholar or thinker, and the American castigated the BBC. How could you platform this person? How could you give them a forum to spew this nonsense? And it's like, that was actually really valuable.
Yes, it's very useful
to hear
right.
this sort of like insane tale that they're ultimately spinning. But they were, they wouldn't even respond to the questions that the BBC host was asking because they just wanted to yell about how mad they were that they had platformed this sort of Kremlin apologist type. I wanted to ask you also, you wrote that from Orwell, war hysteria increases in intensity as one rises in the social scale. And you included a Rasmussen poll that had it broken down by income level, the level of support for U.S. military involvement if a wider war breaks out in Europe. And it's exactly, increases according to how much money you are and where you fall on the wealth scale. Where does that dynamic come from, do you think?
Well, I think the first and most obvious place it comes from is that, the people who don't have money are the ones who are going to end up having to fight. Mm-hmm. So they tend to be a little bit less hot for the idea of going to war again. And this is something that Donald Trump picked up on early in 2016. I started to notice that he started to be a little bit more anti-war in his comments when he visited sort of places in rural America where there were a lot of veterans in the crowd. And he ended up doing well with those voters, by the way. But also, again, it's a cultural change, I think, primarily on the left in America, or what used to be the liberal left in America, which used to be deeply anti-war in its orientation. Now it's become kind of mixed with the neoconservative or sort of aggressive version of muscular foreign policy that was maybe popular under John F. Kennedy. Like that's kind of more the way that the once liberal voters are thinking nowadays. Who's anti-war in popular culture these days? I mean, apart from the little slice of internet of independent media that maybe we occupy, where do you find those voices?
It's weird.
It is weird, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm young, but my entire political awakening was Iraq. I mean, I was like, I was like a teenager. I was like, this is crazy. I was like, this is totally crazy. I grew up in a place where it was very conservative. George W. Bush's presidential library was there, so any of this was total heresy. And I'd be like, well, did you know, 30 soldiers got killed this month in Iraq? People didn't even know. They had no clue about what exactly was happening with the war. And I remember at that time just thinking how dangerous it is. Like, if you're going to look locked in, at that time they were all watching O'Reilly, and they were getting beat into them. The provenance of the war and like how great the war was. And it took years for people to even acknowledge that it was a total and colossal disaster. I guess, that's kind of my final question to you, which is that what's the way out of this for us as a populace? I mean, everybody's mistrusted for a variety of reasons. Everybody's in their own information environment. We may not have Iraq again today. We don't have the same media environment, but Afghanistan showed me that it's very possible to beat the media and the populace into a very specific direction. And I now see the same thing whenever it comes to Russia. I don't know how to get out of this, or is there even an answer?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I was reading something this morning about how Sun Tzu always talked about how when you're fighting an opponent, you need to leave them a golden bridge on which to retreat. And there isn't one right now for Russia. Like, I think what they're looking at, for them, this conflict is an existential affair. Like, they cannot afford to lose militarily in Ukraine. And as we've seen going back to the 90s, when they had tremendous difficulty with a much smaller enemy in Chechnya, they will destroy an entire area rather than suffer a defeat, using the most devastating weapons that they have if they have to. And that's the eventuality that we want to avoid. I think, if there is a negotiated way out of this situation, one that allows them to save face in some way, I think that has to be pursued. But the problem is, we're not allowed to really talk about that, or at least there isn't that kind of dialogue going on right now. The only thing that people want to hear is let's escalate and let's talk about regime change in Russia, which, I could almost understand that thinking, because it is heartbreaking to watch what's going on in Ukraine and the devastation there, and to think, wow, we could be doing something there. We could, with our military, we could be preventing this. The problem is that, then we're talking about risking the lives of everybody on the planet. So this is not a simple situation. You can't just breezily talk about clearing the skies. That's not an answer, Mm-hmm. But we haven't done that because and this gets back to what you were talking about before, Saagar, because of the one-track nature of the dialogue right now. We're not exploring ways out of this situation that are feasible for everybody. All anybody is doing is talking about ways to escalate, and that is my fear, because ultimately our leaders are not as smart as we imagine them to be. No. They are capable of doing something really stupid and starting a nuclear war, and that's what I really worry about in this thing.
They're even dumber than we imagine.
I think that's a really important place to end, because basically the conversation you're talking about, which could create that possibility, that golden bridge for retreat, that's a risky conversation. It's an uncomfortable conversation when the bulk of the media energy and the public energy is in we got to do more, Russia's got to pay a price direction. And so if you close off the avenue to even have that discussion, which is risky and uncomfortable, then you make peace much less likely. Matt Taibbi, so great to have you today. Everybody go subscribe to the Substack, and we'll see you again soon.
Thanks, man.
Thanks so much, Krystal, Saagar. Take care.
Great to see you.
Good to see you.
Thanks so much for watching, guys. We really appreciate it. You guys are the ones who are supporting us. It's a perilous time. Krystal and I have been talking. We've never been more afraid of getting taken off of YouTube for something that we didn't even do, or for trying to present the news in the most objective manner, especially at a time when we are trying to build up as many resources as possible, all these partnerships and expansion for the midterms to give you the best news possible. So it's terrifying landscape out here. You guys are the ones who enable it, and we really appreciate it. So thank you.
Love you guys. Thank you so much. We'll see you again soon.